The box cutter slipped from my fingers when my brother said it. Not because the words were new. Not because I hadn't half expected them somewhere in the back of my mind during the long drive to my father's house, the one I'd spent the last 4 years watching slowly empty of everything except medication bottles and the low hum of a hospital bed. My brother had never once helped me move inside. They weren't new words, but hearing them spoken out loud, in my father's kitchen, 3 days after we'd buried him, made something cold and final settle into my chest. "Dad left you the workshop," my brother said, not looking up from the documents spread across the kitchen table. "I get the house and everything in it. The workshop is yours. The lawyer said there's some personal effects in there too. Tools, probably. Maybe some old junk." He finally glanced up, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. But not quite. Not enough. "It's what he wanted, Claire." I stood there for a moment. The box cutter was on the floor near my shoe. I'd been using it to break down the cardboard boxes I'd brought, the ones I'd assumed I would need to pack up some of my father's things before the estate was divided. I hadn't assumed much. I'd learned not to, over the years. "Okay," I said. My brother blinked. I think he'd been waiting for something else from me. A fight, maybe. Tears. Proof that it had landed the way he'd intended it to land. "Okay?" he repeated. "I heard you," I said. I picked up the box cutter and set it on the counter. "I'll go look at the workshop." I'd been the one who came home. That was the whole story, really, if you wanted to strip everything else away. 4 years ago, when my father's heart condition went from manageable to serious, I was 29 years old, living in Columbus, working as a physical therapist at a sports rehab clinic I actually loved. I had an apartment with good light and a small balcony where I grew tomatoes in the summer. I had a life that was mine in a way that felt, for the first time, completely intentional. My brother was 34 and living in Seattle. He had a tech job he was very proud of and a wife who sent Christmas cards with their dog on them every year, signed in looping cursive with both their names. He called our father on Sundays, sometimes. When he remembered, when Dad's cardiologist called me in September to tell me the situation had shifted, that he was going to need consistent daily support and that living alone was no longer advisable, I drove back to Denton, Ohio in a single 12-hour stretch. I took a leave of absence from my job that turned into a resignation 4 months later, when it became clear I wouldn't be going back anytime soon. I moved into my old bedroom, the one that still had a faded band poster on the inside of the closet door, and a window that stuck every winter. I learned how to manage medication schedules and monitor blood pressure and have conversations with insurance companies that left me gripping the phone until my knuckles ached. My brother flew in for Christmas the first year, stayed 4 days, and told me I was doing a great job. He flew in again the following summer for a long weekend, and took a lot of photos of himself and Dad on the back porch that he posted online. He called them quality time. In the comments, people told him he was such a good son. I did not post anything online. My father was not an easy man to take care of. He wasn't cruel, not exactly, but he had the particular stubbornness of someone who had spent 68 years being entirely self-sufficient and found the loss of that self-sufficiency humiliating in ways he didn't have language for. He picked fights about small things. He refused help and then was angry when the thing he'd refused help with didn't get done. He told me once, during a bad week in his second winter, that I mothered him too much, and he wished I would go back to my own life. I went to my car afterward and sat there for 20 minutes without starting the engine. But there were other times, too. Evenings when he let me sit with him in the workshop while he sorted through old hardware, not saying much. Just the two of us in the yellow light with the radio on low. He'd built that workshop himself in the mid-90s. A serious, well-constructed space attached to the back of the garage, insulated and wired properly, with pegboards on every wall where tools hung in their exact designated spots. He spent hours out there even after his hands weren't reliable enough for the intricate work he used to do. He just liked being in it. He liked the smell of sawdust and machine oil and whatever it held for him that I didn't entirely understand. "You never come out here," he said to me one evening, near the end. He meant my brother. We both knew who he meant. "He's far away," I said, the way I always did. My father made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 weeks after his 69th birthday. It was quiet. I was there. My brother arrived the following afternoon with a rolling suitcase and a grief that seemed to have been pre-packaged and installed sometime during the flight. complete and photogenic, and already processed enough that he could talk about his father in the past tense, without the words catching in his throat. I watched him move through the house touching things, and I felt something I wasn't proud of, something tired and sharp at the same time. The lawyer reading happened 4 days after the funeral. Our father's estate was not enormous, but it was real. The house in Denton was paid off. There were modest savings. There was the workshop and its contents. The lawyer, a dry, efficient man named Peterson, read through the document in a voice that suggested he had done this 1,000 times and intended to do it 1,000 more. The house, its contents, and the savings went to my brother. The workshop, its contents, and my father's personal effects went to me. Peterson did not look up from the document when he read this. My brother shifted in his chair. I looked at the grain of the table. I did not cry in the lawyer's office. I had used up my crying already, in the months before, in increments too small to explain to anyone. After my brother said what he said in the kitchen, I walked out through the back door and across the yard to the workshop. The door was the old one, wood-framed with a metal latch my father had installed himself because he'd never liked the factory versions. I lifted the latch the way I'd watched him do it 1,000 times, with the slight upward pressure before the push, and the door swung open. The smell hit me before anything else. Sawdust and oil and something underneath that I couldn't name but that lived in the back of my memory, warm and specific. I stood in the doorway for a moment without moving. The workshop was exactly as he'd left it. Tools on their pegboards. His workbench along the far wall, surface worn smooth in the places where he worked most often. A shelf of labeled coffee cans holding screws and bolts, and small hardware sorted by size. His old radio, a boxy thing from the 90s with a telescoping antenna bent at an angle that had never affected the reception. I walked in slowly and ran my hand along the edge of the workbench. There was an envelope there, sitting in the center of the workbench, not hidden, just placed there deliberately, with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. Not Claire, my full name, the one he used when he was being serious. My hands were not entirely steady when I picked it up. I stood at his workbench in the smell of sawdust and oil and read my father's letter. He had written it 6 months ago, during a period when he was feeling well enough to be careful, he said. He wanted to be careful. He wanted me to understand things in the right order. He had known, he wrote, that the division would look uneven to the outside eye. He asked me to keep reading before I decided anything. Then, he told me about the cabinet. Along the back wall of the workshop, behind a shelf unit he'd built to hold lumber offcuts, there was a steel cabinet. He'd installed it 8 years ago, before I'd come home, when he still had full use of his hands and the particular foresight that had always been one of his defining qualities. He gave me the combination in the letter, written out in the careful way he wrote numbers, each digit distinct and unambiguous. He said the cabinet held documents. He said I should read them carefully. He said he had spent a long time thinking about who understood what responsibility meant, and he had arrived at an answer he was confident in. He said he was sorry it had taken him so long to say certain things out loud, and that he hoped the letter made up for some of that. He signed it the way he signed everything. First initial, last name, the way he'd signed birthday cards my whole life. And I had always thought it was impersonal, but standing there I understood suddenly that it was just how he was, that it had never meant what I'd feared it meant. I set the letter down on the workbench. Then I moved the lumber shelf. It was heavy, but it rolled on the casters he'd fitted to the bottom. He thought of things like that. Always, and behind it, set flush into the wall, was the cabinet. Gunmetal gray, combination lock, exactly where he said it would be. I entered the combination. The lock released. I want to tell you that I understood immediately what I was looking at. I didn't, not all of it, not right away. There were folders, organized in the careful way he organized everything, labeled in his handwriting. I pulled them out one at a time and set them on the workbench in the dim light of the workshop, and I read. The first thing I understood was the property. 12 years ago, my father had purchased a parcel of land. Not large, not visible from any road my brother or I would have driven down. It was agricultural land about 40 minutes outside of Denton, purchased quietly for an amount that had seemed modest at the time. He'd said nothing about it to either of us. In the folder was the deed, his name on it, clean and simple, and beneath the deed were a series of more recent documents, appraisals, correspondence with a commercial real estate firm, surveys. The land sat adjacent to a corridor that a regional distribution company had quietly been acquiring parcels along for the past 3 years. The most recent appraisal, dated 14 months ago, placed its value at an amount that made me put the folder down and press both palms flat on the workbench. The second thing I understood was the account. My father had kept a separate savings account for 20 years. Modest annual contributions, reinvested and left alone. The kind of account that doesn't announce itself. The balance was in the folder, printed on a recent statement. And it was more than I had made in the last 4 years of caregiving combined. The third thing I understood was why. There was another letter in the cabinet, shorter than the first, written on the same paper in the same careful hand. He had not addressed it to me by name this time. It was addressed to whoever found it, and it said that whoever found it was the person he had always known would find it because they would be the one who came out to the workshop, who knew how the door latch worked, who had sat with him in the evenings without needing conversation to fill the space. He said that certain things revealed themselves over time if you paid attention. He said he had paid attention. I sat down on the old stool by his workbench and I held the letters and I did not move for a long time. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard the back door of the house open. My brother's footsteps across the yard, unhurried, the walk of someone who has decided something and is coming to deliver it. He appeared in the workshop doorway. "Listen," he said. "I know the split seams." He stopped. He looked at the cabinet, open, the folders on the workbench. He looked at me. "What is that?" "Come in," I said. "Close the door." He came in slowly. He didn't close the door. He looked at the folders the way you look at something when you're trying to determine how worried you should be. "What is all that?" he said again. "Dad left me some documents," I said. "In the cabinet he built back here. 8 years ago, apparently." My brother's eyes moved across the folders. I watched him recognize the name of the real estate firm on one of the tabs. He'd worked in tech long enough to know what commercial real estate correspondence looked like. "What kind of documents?" he said, and his voice had changed in a way he probably wasn't aware of. I told him plainly, the way our father would have told it: no performance, no extended pauses for effect, just the facts in order. The land, the account, the appraisals, the timeline. My brother was very quiet for a while. "He never said anything," he finally said. "No," I agreed. He stopped. Started again. "He just never said anything to me about any of this." I looked at him across the workbench, in the workshop that smelled like our father, with the tools on their pegboards and the labeled coffee cans and the radio with the bent antenna. I thought about Christmas visits. I thought about long weekends and photos on the back porch. I thought about Sunday calls, sometimes, when he remembered. I thought about the drawer in the kitchen where I had kept the medication schedule printed out and laminated, updated every time the cardiologist adjusted something, which had been often. I thought about the night his oxygen level dropped and I sat beside his bed for 6 hours watching the monitor until it stabilized. I thought about the insurance calls and the pharmacy arguments and the 3 times I rearranged the furniture to accommodate equipment that then needed to be rearranged again. I thought about being tired in a way that had no bottom. "He paid attention," I said. "That's what his letter says. He paid attention, and he made decisions based on what he saw." My brother looked at me. There was something moving across his face that I recognized as the beginning of an argument. The kind where the person knows they don't have the moral ground but is casting around for any available foothold. I had seen this expression on him since we were children. "You can be angry," I said, before he could find the foothold. "That's okay. I'm not telling you not to be." He blinked. "But I want you to understand something," I said. "I'm not going to fight with you about what Dad decided. I'm not going to drag this through lawyers or make it ugly. That's not what I want." I set my father's first letter on top of the folders and smoothed it once with my palm. "What I want is to handle this the way he would have wanted it handled. Carefully, without drama." My brother stared at the letter with his name written at the top in our father's handwriting. "He wrote you one too," I said. "It's in the cabinet. I didn't read it. It's addressed to you." He looked up at me sharply. "Take it," I said. "It's yours." I left him there. I walked back across the yard and into the house, and I made coffee in the kitchen the way my father had taught me, with the old percolator he refused to replace because he didn't see the point in replacing something that worked. I stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, and I looked out at the workshop, at the yellow light coming through the small window, at my brother's silhouette visible inside. He was sitting on the stool. He was reading. I poured my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and I let him have the time he needed. He came inside an hour later. He sat down across from me and he put the letter on the table between us, and he didn't say anything for a while. His eyes were red in a way I hadn't seen from him in a very long time, maybe not since we were teenagers. Maybe not since the last time something had reached him before he had the chance to prepare for it. "He knew I wasn't there," my brother said. "Yes," I said. He didn't say it like. He picked up the letter and then set it back down. It wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. He just said he knew. He rubbed one hand over his jaw. He said he hoped I understood what that cost. I didn't say anything. "Did you know any of this?" he asked. "The land? The account? Any of it?" "No," I said. "I had no idea. You never looked? In 4 years, you never." "It was his workshop," I said. "I went out there to be with him, not to look through things." My brother was quiet again. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "It came out the way things come out when they've been stored in a pressurized space for a very long time. Abrupt and almost involuntary. He didn't expand on it, didn't explain what specifically he was sorry for. I think he understood that the specifics were too many to list. "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "With the property, the account." "I haven't decided yet," I said honestly. "I need time to think." I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. "But I'm not going to do anything that cuts you out. You're my brother. Whatever I do, you'll know about it." He looked at me in a way that I understood. It was the look of someone receiving something they hadn't known they needed until it arrived. "Dad said that about you," he said, quieter. "In the letter, he said you were the one who held things together without needing to be noticed for it." I looked down at my coffee. "He said he should have told you that more often." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray, the light flattened and still. The kind of March afternoon that can't decide if it wants to be winter or something else. I had spent 4 winters in this kitchen. I had learned the sounds of this house at every hour, the way the pipes settled at night, and the particular creak of the 3rd step, and the sound of my father's cough that meant he was fine, and the slightly different sound that meant I should get up. I would be selling the property. Not immediately, not impulsively, but I had looked at those appraisal numbers, and I knew what they meant. I knew what the account meant. I knew what it meant to have 4 years of my life returned to me in the form of a future I had almost stopped being able to imagine. I was going to be careful with it. I was going to be deliberate. I was going to take time with every decision because that was what the money represented, time, the thing I had given, returned in the only currency available. And I was going to let my brother be part of what came next, because disregarding him would have been easy, and easy was not the same as right. My father had not raised us to choose the easy version of things. He had raised us by example, in a workshop, with labeled coffee cans and tools on their proper hooks. And even if my brother had spent a long time not paying attention to that lesson, I had been paying attention. I intended to keep paying attention. That was what the letter had said. In the end, the shorter one, the one addressed to whoever found it, he had said, "The workshop is yours because you understood that some things are worth preserving. Some things are worth the time they cost. I know you know this already, but I wanted to say it once, plainly, in a way you could hold on to." I held on to it. A week later, I drove back to Columbus. My apartment was long gone, and I stayed in a hotel for the first few nights while I sorted through the logistics of beginning again in a city I had once known well. I called the physical therapy clinic that had hired me fresh out of school, not because I expected anything from them, just because I wanted to understand what the landscape looked like now. They called me back the same afternoon. The field had changed while I was away. And some of what I'd been doing in those 4 years, managing complex medication interactions, coordinating care under pressure, navigating systems that didn't want to be navigated, turned out to translate in ways I hadn't anticipated. I called the real estate firm whose name I'd seen on the folder, the one my father had been corresponding with. I asked for a meeting. I brought the appraisals and the deed and the account statements, and I sat across from a woman in a gray blazer who looked at the documents and then looked at me with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their expectations. "Your father was patient," she said. "Yes," I said, "he was." My brother called me on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after I'd gone back to Columbus. Not the kind of call where you can tell someone has scheduled themselves a task and is completing it. The kind where you can tell they've picked up the phone before they fully decided to, because it felt like the right thing to do. We talked for an hour and a half. About Dad, about the workshop, about things we hadn't talked about in years, the version of our childhood that existed before we each developed the interpretations we'd carried into adulthood. He told me things I hadn't known. I told him things I hadn't said. We didn't resolve everything. You don't resolve everything in one phone call. And I have never trusted people who claim otherwise, but when we said goodnight, I felt something that had been pulled tight for a long time release a small amount of its tension. I kept the percolator. When I eventually found an apartment in Columbus with enough counter space to justify it, I set it on the counter next to the window and I used it every morning. It was heavy and inefficient, and occasionally unpredictable in the manner of things designed to last rather than to perform. And it made coffee the way my father had made it, which was to say strong and without ceremony, and every morning when I poured a cup from it, I thought about yellow light and sawdust and the way a combination lock releases when you enter the right numbers. I thought about a letter on a workbench with my name on it. I thought about what it means to be seen, quietly, by someone who doesn't say it aloud until they have no other way left to say it. I thought about what my father had known. In that long, particular way, he knew things, watching and waiting and sorting and labeling, finding the right place for everything. I thought, some inheritances aren't in the will. Some of them are in what you carry out the door with you, in the things you learned without knowing you were learning them, in the patience that becomes native to you after long enough, and the steadiness that persists even when there is no immediate reason for it to persist. My father had not been a sentimental man, but he had been a careful one, and he had left me, in the end, the most careful thing he could leave me. He had left me proof that he had been paying attention all along. I picked up my coffee, and I stood at the window, and the city moved below me, its ordinary, purposeful morning motion, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not merely the absence of exhaustion. I felt like someone who had been handed a beginning. I intended to use it well.